before we get into the details of the policy, I want to let you know that these slides that we're going through this evening more or less follow the written policy section by section, although it doesn't have all of the detailed information. We're going to ask you before too long to have sign off that you actually have read the policy and understand what we are doing and why. But one of the questions that comes up regularly is, why do we have a safe place policy? What is this all about? And I'm going to read here what's written in the beginning of the policy as the preamble to it, and it says that the local church is part of the community in which it exists, and it aims to be recognized as a place of love and safety. Young people are not only the church of the future, they are a valuable part of the church and community today. However, our children, youth, and some adults are also vulnerable. Due to perceived weakness, lack of awareness and knowledge, sometimes they are taken advantage of and become victims of abuse. Therefore, it is imperative that we proactively protect them and provide safe environments. We must also protect those who serve our children, youth, and vulnerable adults. Ministry personnel need the security of knowing that there are processes and procedures in place to minimize the possibility of false accusations. That, in a nutshell, is why we have a safe place policy. It is a legal requirement for us to follow through on the provisions in this policy so that we are covered by our liability insurance and so that we don't run into legal problems down the road. So that being said, let's get into some of the definitions of the terms that we are talking about here in this safe place policy. Abuse. Abuse is a non-accidental act committed by a person in a position of trust, which harms or threatens a vulnerable person's physical or mental health or welfare. Abuse is primarily categorized as being physical, sexual, emotional, or involving neglect. For the purposes of this policy, a child is an individual who is under the age of 18. There's a new term here, a term that we haven't really recognized in our previous policies, and that is hall monitors. Now, hall monitors are ministry personnel whose role is to provide general surveillance and to visit rooms where vulnerable persons are being supervised. An extension of this idea of hall monitors is part of why we are asking ushers in particular to be part of this training, because during services and programs here on a Sunday morning, they are the ones who are aware of the space and seeing what's going on in various areas of the church when other people are gathered here for worship. Ministry lead. Individuals who have completed the screening process and are responsible for a ministry or a program. So many of you here are ministry leaders, and then you have volunteers and others who work with you. Ministry personnel. These are individuals who have completed the screening process of this policy and are deemed to be in a position of trust and may serve with vulnerable persons. Now here we get into some interesting aspects of our definitions. An occasional observer. What is an occasional observer? These are individuals who rarely visit and observe ministry personnel with ministry activities. This includes parents assisting their own children, for instance in children's programming. They do not need to be screened or trained, but their access to minors must be limited and will never be placed in a position of trust. And this refers to church programming and events only. So in other words, when we do things like Venture Next Door events, or when we do a drop-in, or when we have some of our children's program, sometimes the parents want to be there and see what's going on, even help out a little bit. And that's fine. That's not a problem, even though they're not a screened adult. It just means that we are then conscious of their level of access and and we make sure that we do not leave them in charge of anyone. A position of trust is any position where one is depended on to be trustworthy and to serve in a manner that is beyond reproach. It includes any role wherein parents have entrusted their loved one to your care. Unrelated adults. This is one we've run into a number of times, And for the purposes of this safe place policy, unrelated adults are defined as a pair of adults who are not married, who are not divorced, or cohabiting. This does not refer to siblings or to parent-child relationships. So, for instance, often in a program we will have a parent and a child who are working with a class or with a small group. That's fine. They're not, for the purposes of the policy, considered related adults, even though they are related by blood. Related here refers specifically to being in a marriage or romantic relationship. All right? And finally, vulnerable adult. A vulnerable adult is an individual 18 years or older who, due to age, disability, or other circumstance, temporary or permanent, is in a position of considerable dependence on others. This definition can also include someone like a refugee, who, for instance, is new to the culture, new to the language, and is dependent on others who are helping them for access to services or to receive the support that they need. That is a dependent relationship, and therefore they're considered to be vulnerable, especially when we talk about when we have people who represent the church who are interacting with such persons. All right, let's see where we go from here. So, who needs protection under this policy or through this policy? Well, certainly children and our youth, certainly vulnerable adults. We often would think of vulnerable adults as being those who maybe because of age or infirmity are, maybe confused or easily confused, like me, that need support in a tangible way. But vulnerable adults are also those with disabilities, are also those, for the purpose of the policy, as we mentioned, those who, for temporary reasons, may also be dependent on others. The elderly and those with disabilities. Our volunteers and staff are also protected by this policy because of the strategies that are put in place to ensure that situations won't happen. Our church, as an organization, and the community both need protection. We want to make sure that we are seen and known in the community as people who value our integrity and value our children in such a way that we are willing to go as far as we need to make sure that people can trust us. And sometimes that feels like we've done a lot and we've worked really hard at it. But it's for the purposes of being seen as people of integrity. And I'll come back to this in just a second. And then the community needs to be protected. If we are inviting the community into this space on a regular basis, we want them to know that this is a place of safety and trust. And finally, the conference also needs to be protected. And they depend on us as the local church to follow these policies because they are the ones ultimately that carry a lot of the liability, and many things such as our physical location, our buildings, and that sort of thing are all tied into the conference. And when there is a lawsuit, for instance, that would impact the whole conference and not just one congregation. One of the reasons that these policies are so important is that as we have been told by the conference as they've worked through this process, is that religious workers, those who are working as volunteers in religious organizations, are no longer seen in our society as people who are worthy of trust. We are characterized as being higher risk volunteers than even many other community programs. Now, we at Fort Garry might get a little bit, incensed by that. How can that possibly? We know who we are. We know how we love and care for people. We would never do those things. The truth is that you don't have to go very far in the newspaper or on the websites these days to find out instances where religious workers have abused the trust of those in their care. So let's talk now about some categories of abuse and what we're actually talking about when we talk about different kinds of abuse. The categories in this policy that are laid out are physical abuse, sexual, emotional, neglect, and spiritual. And each of these has its own definition. Now, physical abuse is, things resulting in injury of a vulnerable person. Sexual abuse. I think we're going through these in the next categories. The note that I want to include here is that these categories are not always cut and dry. They're not always just one kind of abuse that we're talking about. Often there are multiple facets of abuse that are taking place. So physical abuse is any physical force or action that results in or could result in injury. It's different than what would be considered reasonable discipline. And here at Fort Garry, we are very clear that no ministry personnel are ever to engage in corporal, that is physical punishment of any sort. That is not our right in any way. And so that's just completely unacceptable. Sexual abuse. Child sexual abuse occurs when a child is used for sexual gratification of an adult or an older child. And it can include things such as sexual intercourse, indecent phone calls, emails, or sexting, fondling for sexual pleasure, exposing a child's private areas, or allowing a child to look at, perform in pornographic pictures or videos, or to engage in prostitution. Now, those are some of the definitions, and some of those seem like very far outside of what we would be thinking of in terms of our own context, but that is something that we need to be aware of. Emotional abuse is a pattern of behavior that attacks an individual's emotional development, their sense of self-worth, dignity, and identity. It includes failure by a parent to provide the child with love, emotional support, and guidance. And children who are exposed to violence in their homes may suffer emotional harm. It includes excessive, aggressive, or unreasonable demands that place expectations on someone that are beyond their capacity. It can be really easy, or sometimes too easy, to jump to conclusions about emotional abuse. It's difficult to pinpoint some of the indicators of this kind of abuse. And so we need to be careful before we put a label on something as emotional abuse. Rather, our response, if we do have suspicions of such, is to document it, keep note of it, keep track of it, and then we can follow up on it as we go along, just as with other forms of abuse. Neglect is the failure to meet the basic needs for food, clothing, shelter, sleep, medical attention, education, and protection from harm. This can occur when caregivers do not know about appropriate care, or when they cannot adequately supervise, or when they are unable to plan ahead. One of the reasons that we talk about neglect as a form of abuse is that we are also including neglect with children in our program. Finally, spiritual abuse. We believe this is a statement created by the Manitoba Conference team that speaks to this, though they haven't included a definition of such. We believe the gospel of Jesus Christ and affirm the importance of Christian evangelism. However, we do not believe that this justifies any means to fulfill that end. Hence, we disavow the use of any techniques that bypass a person's critical faculties, take advantage of weaknesses, limits the capacity of, or disrespects an individual's freedom to choose. We've gone through a lot of definitions. I would like to pause for a moment here, and if there are some questions about any of those definitions or something that you were thinking that you would hear but didn't, please, I'm glad to hear that. Going on then to the prevalence of abuse. Now, we would like to think that these sorts of things don't happen, and certainly within the context of the faith community, we can't imagine that these things should happen. These comments here come from a Statistics Canada report from 2008, and I know that's 10 years old, but these statistics are still very valid, and in fact, if they have changed at all, it is likely not for the better, I would suggest. The first is that 1 in 3 females is sexually abused before the age of 16. And the same is true for every 1 in 7 males. Think about that for a second. If that's new to you, let that sink in. But when you think of how many people are in this congregation, you can see that just demographically, this applies to a lot of people here, even within our own congregation. The rate of physical assault of males sharply increases at around age 9 and usually peaks somewhere at around age 17. The sexual assault rate is 1.5 times higher for children and youth than for young adults, 18 through 24. So once they hit 18, abuse the trends go down a little bit. 59% of all victims of sexual assault in 2008 were children and youth, 82% of which were female. The rate of sexual victimization of females peaks at ages 13 through 15. In this range, the perpetrators are usually known to the victim, but are not usually family members. So 13 to 15 is kind of the peak time for females, girls in our society, in our culture. And children who are younger than 13, girls who are younger than 13, it is usually a family member, not a stranger or somebody else in the community that is the perpetrator. We want to note as well that abuse largely goes unreported to authorities for various reasons. And we also need to remember that not all sexual abuse is necessarily molestation or rape, but can also include things like unwanted touching, inappropriate behavior and kissing, photography, all those sorts of things as well. About 1/3 of the time, the perpetrator is a peer of the victim or of similar age. What the difference between sexual exploration, experimentation of peers, and what we would call peer abuse is the level of coercion or manipulation that's going on. When one person is in a position of power for whatever reason in the relationship dynamics over the other. So knowing this, what is our responsibility? Our responsibility as camps, clubs, schools, and churches is that we can be vulnerable places because we are considered to be places of trust. And unfortunately, we often lack the necessary screening for volunteers and staff that you would find in a professional workplace or in communities. And therefore, this can provide an opportunity for predators to come into contact with those who are vulnerable. If someone is abused outside of the church, they might question the existence of God. How could God let this happen if there is a God? And if someone is abused inside the church, it can actually tragically affect their view of who God is and what it means to be a part of a community of faith. And so we bear a tremendous responsibility. Jesus made sure that children knew that he was a safe person. And we, as followers of Christ, want to represent his character and his passion for the least of these. His love for children and for those who are hurting, his desire for righteousness for us and for all those around us. So, having gone through these definitions and talked about the prevalence of abuse in its various forms within our society, we come to this concluding statement about abuse. Abuse sucks. That's a very mild term. You can insert another term in there if you want to. Abuse is horrible, terrible, awful, tragic evil. It is evil. It is everything that God is not. We know that. But now that we have some definitions, and we have a better understanding of what abuse is, now we can learn about how we can prevent and protect against abuse here in the context of the church. So I'm going to invite Ruth to come and lead us through the next part.
Right, so let's talk about our standards of protection and prevention now that we know all these things. Some of the things we already have been working on and will continue to be worked on. For example, we do have a customized written policy now. We've gone through the definitions of abuse. We are always screening volunteers and staff. That's an ongoing issue. We're training volunteers and staff, and we have modified the premises in the past, and will continue to modify if need be as well. We have organizational procedures, including permanent documentation of information, also an ongoing thing, and we have a reporting and response protocol that is also ongoing. So how do we reduce abuse, reduce the risk of possible abuse? There are some general guidelines that we want to follow. And these are important to take note of. When risk increases, supervision should also increase. Risk increases as isolation increases. Risk increases as accountability and adherence to policy decreases. Risk increases when there is an imbalance of power or influence. Key to demonstrating due diligence in care is through retaining documentation. We really need to understand those points, understand our need to strategize care through all these supervising of our volunteers, of screening them, and documenting, especially in the areas of attendance, knowing who's there and when as well. We also want to prevent abuse with knowledge. Policies and procedures are great ways to create safe communities and prevent abuse. But there is always a chance of it happening anywhere. Knowing how to spot the indicators or abuse indicators is key to helping vulnerable people who are being abused. So how do we spot those potential abuse indicators? Here are some. Extreme changes in personality and behavior. Now, if you're working with junior high students, well, there's a lot of that going around anyways. But you understand. Injuries for which there is no explanation, or the explanation doesn't make sense. Injuries at different stages of healing. Unusual fear, aggression, rages, or tantrums. Again, tantrums in 2-year-olds, okay, there's not necessarily a sign of abuse. It's developmental, right? So we have to take these things into consideration as well. Extremely secretive or forbidden contact with others, withdrawing from loved ones and activities, age-inappropriate sexual play or knowledge, unexplained developmental setbacks. The example given is wetting themselves, so if they have already gone through toilet training and they're well beyond those years and suddenly they're 10 years old and they're wetting the bed again. It's something to take note of. Evidence of inadequate care, unusual bank account activity. Now this is regarding vulnerable adults as well. Frequent psychosomatic complaints as well. So those are some indicators of abuse. Some key points to spotting abuse as well. Things that we need to do when we do spot abuse. Complete and submit an incident report for each indicator that you spot. Even if you're unsure, document it. Watch for a pattern of indicators, but don't jump to conclusions, just pay attention. Remember, Also, that hurt people hurt people. If someone is hurting others, it's likely a cry for help. Also something to watch for. So when reporting and responding to abuse, we report and respond to child abuse and vulnerable adults' abuse differently. First, we report child abuse. It is a legal requirement that we report. Everyone is legally required to report child abuse when witnessed. But we respond to vulnerable adult abuse. They are adults. They decide for themselves if they want to go forward with any kind of reporting of abuse as well. But we can certainly walk with them on that journey. Why should you report abuse? We didn't mention that. It's just the right thing to do. We're required to do so. There it is. Duty to report is a law in Canada that requires everyone to report known abuse. And there's the phone number as well. Reporting child abuse. So what do you think what happens if you call CFS with a suspicion or reporting abuse? Some of those questions might be in your minds. CFS responds in different ways to different calls, but always opens or updates a file. The degree to which they respond depends largely on the type of abuse reported. Here are a bit more details about the reporting child abuse. Every province and territory, of course, has their own legislation. Things that they will address are the ages of children entitled to protection under the law, which is the age of majority. Here in Manitoba, it's 18. The duty to report is immediate. It is against the law to hinder, stop, or impede a report. You do not need the permission or approval of church staff or of the council members to make a report. But of course, it's a really good idea to include us in all that as well. But you're not obligated to.
But you guys are there to support us too, if we need to do that.
Yes, we're there to support you as well in that, for sure. We wouldn't leave you by yourself. And the duty to report is also direct, as Vivian was saying. A witness of abuse or the person with a suspicion must be the person making the report. And there's also an ongoing report. You must report each instance of abuse and each new piece of information, even if it seems there is no response to your reports from the agency. Or if you know that one person has already made a report, but you also saw the incident or heard about it, you must also call in. Each person's perspective and language is different, and so the more information authorities can collect, the more accurate of a picture they can develop. Again, on reporting child abuse. When you're speaking to a child or to a youth, when you're involved in ministry in those areas, don't ask leading questions about things you might have heard or what they might have said. But do immediately report the abuse to authorities, and this can be done with your supervisor. Inform your supervisor, and they will inform others on a need-to-know basis. Remove individuals accused of abuse. If it happens within the church, of course, if it's a co-worker, someone you were serving alongside, that person will have to be, step aside as well immediately. Protect the identity of the victim and the accused. That's very important as well. Resist investigating allegations or suspicions, and cooperate with the official investigators. We need to trust the authorities to do their job. Church staff are here to help the hurting individuals, and the conference staff will deal with whatever legal ramifications might come up as well through the media. So in responding, before we talk about reporting child abuse, with vulnerable adults, we respond to adult abuse. So we have to ask ourselves when we're working with vulnerable adults, is this an emergency? If so, excuse me. If so, then call 911. Is the individual in that? Walk alongside them. Is the victim ready to respond? Now, in some cases, they might know what's happening. They understand that they maybe should do something about it, but they don't want to. And so that is their right as well. But we are there to walk alongside them, make a plan maybe with them when they are ready to report, and have a plan for next steps. Provide a phone number they can call for help, arrange for a follow-up visit, develop a safety plan for when they're ready. We're supposed to be a place where we prevent those things, and we have policies and procedures in place where we prevent any possibility of those kinds of things happening as well. So it's prevention by supervision. So let's brainstorm. First of all, what activities, programs, and events do we have that are higher risk? In our church, right here, yep.
I'm thinking maybe overnight ones, new trips or retreats.
Yeah, overnight things, canoe trips, retreats, higher risk. I know you're thinking Mission Impossible. Boys Club, yeah. Best fun ever. Which age groups do you think are higher risk?
The younger children.
What's that?
The younger children?
Young ones?
And juniors.
Junior high?
Yeah.
Someone said. Are there rooms, areas, or facilities that we have that are higher risk, where higher risk activities could occur? Are there spaces that we have that could be conducive to back stairs, kids running around back there on their own, not locked down, of course, because there are fire exits, but they can get in. Yeah? If our gym closet big doors haven't been locked on a Sunday morning and kids can get in there and climb chairs and take a nap there, I've seen that happen. Kids can disappear in there. It's a higher risk area. There are places we need to be aware of those things as well. Staff ratios. You recognize some of those people in that picture? Again, prevention by supervision. So staff ratios are so important. It's 2 screen volunteers for every 6 infants. That's 0 to 17 months. 2 screen volunteers for every 10 toddlers, for every 20 elementary age children, for 14 junior high and middle school students, for 20 senior high school students. Yes, you heard that right. 20 vulnerable adults and 6 children with disabilities, right? So again, someone mentioned junior high where the greatest risk will happen, and that's why there's increased supervision for that age group. They're just growing and their feet are larger than their bodies at times and all kinds of things that are happening at that age. Again, with prevention by supervision. So supervision ratios might seem daunting, but you can get creative. You need a minimum of 2 unrelated personnel, except in an emergency, or 1 personnel with windows having clear lines of sight or an open door with hall monitors. So in our lower level, in our children's ministry, we have a hall monitor, people like myself and others who will be watching all the rooms regularly. Especially if there's only 1 person in the room. Don't be alone with a vulnerable person. The key is to stay in sight of others. Never be in the washroom alone with children. So keep the door propped open and have hall monitors walk by regularly. That's what we do in Sunday mornings. If the child needs to go in, the door is always propped open. A leader might stand at the door if they need to go in to help. A hall monitor is brought to the others to the door as well, so they stand and watch the other person help the child in the bathroom. Encourage older children to use the buddy system, so they go together. Prevention by supervision for youth. Supervision of youth is tricky, but remember, again, avoid isolation. This is the main point. Don't date a student. Even if there's not a big age difference, just don't. Travel in groups with another adult, ideally a screened adult. If that's not possible, notify your ministry lead ASAP with an email and text. That's part of the documentation. And call their parents on speaker to avoid isolation. Plan one-on-one meetings to be in sight of other screened adults, either in the church or in public. Always communicate with the parents and ministry lead about the meeting details and submit the one-on-one meetings details form. Now, I know youth leaders, you have talked about this probably a lot with Janessa and with Tyson as well. And if you have more questions on that, I'm sure you'll talk further. Here's the form, possible form to fill in as well for one-on-one meetings with youth. Appropriate displays of affection. For preschoolers, it's always okay to hold a crying child, to comfort them. When you're speaking to them, speak to them at eye level. Put an arm around their shoulder, a nice side hug. Pat hand, shoulder, or back to affirm. Hold a young child's hand when speaking, listening, or walking to an activity together. Those are all appropriate things to do. But also make sure that all touch is done in view of others. High fives, fist bumps are great. It's all good stuff there. Of course, inappropriate. Kissing or coaxing someone to kiss you. Engaging in extended hugging and tickling. Holding someone's face. Touching in any area covered by a bathing suit. Carrying older children. Engaging in prolonged physical contact. And of course, corporal punishment. Never allowed. All right. Also note, sometimes you may have a family member that you are working with, your own child or a nephew or a niece, and you may have different, you might display affection differently to them. It's important to not do that in a public area here as well, because some people might not know, well, that's your nephew or niece, or that's your child, and wonder what's going on. Unless there's a clear understanding that this is your child or your relative, also keep to the boundaries as well listed for that. Protection procedures. So it's important to identify ministry personnel during programs. So that's why we have lanyards and name tags as well that we wear during the time we are interacting with children and youth. And for those as well on Sunday morning for our hosting and for greeters as well, there's identity, they have identity, right now you have tags you wear, there'll be also lanyards as well that you'll wear. It's important not to leave children unattended. Limit the responsibility of occasional observers. They can't supervise. Carl mentioned this earlier as well. Sometimes on a Sunday morning, obviously we have parents sometimes who will drop off their kids and their kids don't want mom or dad to leave. It's okay for them to stay. I'll always say, of course it's okay for them to stay. But they cannot be put in a position of trust, meaning they can't be left alone with the children, unless of course they also happen to be screened. But they're allowed to be there, but they shouldn't be left alone with the kids. Avoid accepting contagious children into programming. Encourage parents to deal with diapers or washroom need before programming. Sign-in, sign-out system, of course, for children is our way of keeping track of them for attendance, and of course to ensure that they don't get lost. We know the number of kids we have listed on our sheet is exactly the number of kids that I count as well when they're in a room. Older children may come and go in the buddy system if hall monitors are utilized. Record keeping. As I mentioned as well, registration forms for each program. So it's something already we do in children's ministry, and I'm sure youth ministry as well. We have a record of everybody who's in the program. And we take attendance at each event, noting all present. So that includes the children, youth, and all the volunteers, and even the guests as well when they come in. Parent information and release forms for all high-risk activities. So we need to keep those records as well. In situations where policy cannot be met, get permission from ministry lead and parents, keeping, again, all the documents. Always, again, document is the point. Fill out an incident report for any accidents, injuries, illnesses, or indicators or suspicions of abuse. That's important, and we will keep those records indefinitely because there is no statute of limitations on child abuse. And so that's why we need to keep them. Health and safety guidelines. Course personnel should not give any over-the-counter medications without written authorization and instruction from physician or parent. If it is necessary to provide medication, prescription must be in original container. Parents must complete medication form with instructions. Requests signed, dated, and filed permanently. Medication given by parent designated leader. And it also suggests that at least one ministry personnel be first aid certified as well. Also with health and safety guidelines, personnel should be informed of severe allergies with details noted on registration forms, know how to administer an EpiPen and asthma inhaler. Incident reports. Fill out an incident report for any accidents, injuries, illnesses, or indicators of abuse. Fill out an incident report for anything out of the ordinary. Now, that's a pretty broad statement. So not necessarily just for kids hurting themselves, but maybe there was an altercation or a yelling match or something unusual or different. I'm not sure. Anything that seems out of the ordinary. To document that is also a good idea. Fill out an incident report for any unintentional or accidental situation that could be misinterpreted or misconstrued. They really want us to document lots of things. So we need to keep track of those things. So include who, what, where, when, why, and how. Keeping these incident reports is also good, not just so we have records of them, but also to notice that there's patterns of indicators, increased communication and accountability, and to have documentation of facts of anything that someone might remember falsely later on. Bullying or harassment among peers. Bullying is common in schools, clubs, teams, churches, and camps. Clearly states zero tolerance and anti-bullying rules. All personnel must take action to prevent and stop bullying. You complete incident reports and immediately notify your ministry lead as well as both sets of parents. Caring for vulnerable people include protecting them from harming one another. I think it's important to have a bit more information on bullying than what we were given here in this policy. The bullyingcanada.ca has some great information on bullying, and I have handouts here as well that I think are important for people, especially that are working with children and youth. Everyone should take one of these as well. So on one side, it has myths of bullying. What are the myths about bullying? Myth 1, children have got to learn to stand up for themselves. Myth number 2, children should hit back, only harder. Myth number 3, it builds character. Myth number 4, sticks and stones can break your bones, but words can never hurt you. Myth number 5, that's not bullying, they're just teasing. Myth number 6, there have always been bullies and there always will be. Myth number 7, well, kids will be kids. Each statement comes with a reality check underneath it. I'm not going to read through it. But these are important things for you to know as well and recognize. Things to notice as well include kids who are punching, shoving, spreading bad rumors, keeping certain people out of a group, teasing people in a mean way, getting certain people to gang up on others. There's all kinds of bullying, of course, as well. Verbal bullying, social bullying, physical and cyber bullying. And the effects as well are listed here as well. There's lots of effects to bullying. Kids might withdraw from family and activities, stomach aches, headaches, panic attacks, not being able to sleep, sleeping too much, etc. So I think this will be important as well. I'll have this at the back. So again, if you are working with children and youth especially, or whoever else wants one as well, it'll be back there for you to pick up. So off-site trips and retreats, and this will mostly be about youth, but always secure ministry lead approval for those kinds of events, secure parent written permission, increase supervision, right? It's a higher risk activity. Separate lodgings according to gender, separate host, billeting families must be screened if that's what happens. Transportation. Travel with minimum 2 screened staff. Use commercial vehicles when possible. Encourage parents to create a carpool system for dropping kids off and up from programs. When using personal vehicles, demonstration of both the current license and insurance in place is required, as well as 5 years of good driving history. So good driving history means no charges of reckless driving, DUIs, or high number of demerits. And maybe that's subjective, high number of demerits. When isolation cannot be avoided, parents and ministry lead must both give permission with records kept permanently. And such occurrences should be rare. Again, that will say then falls under the youth program for transportation. Technology. Parent permission is required to electronically communicate with minors. Collect on registration forms each year on the parent permission. Social media should only be used for communication of information, not the primary method of relationship building and support. Stick to public pages and big group messages that include the program's ministry personnel. Avoid isolation by including parents or other ministry personnel in electronic messages. If ever there is something you're unsure of, speak to your ministry lead about it and keep original copies or screenshots of the conversation. Now I know for people involved in youth ministry, this is a tricky area and it's an ever-changing area. And I know Tyson and Janessa will be, engaging more with you as well on those questions, because I'm sure those things will be changing as we go on as well. It's a tricky area. Any comments about that? Photography and videography. All photos and videos should be taken by screened personnel. No photographs of minors will be taken without prior written approval. No photographs will be posted online without written permission. And of course, never tag your photos when there's children or youth in them. I don't want to drag it on. I just want to make sure everybody has full understanding and a grasp of what's been talked about. Again, we'll be sending you the slides as well, another date, and also a copy of the policy. It's, I think, only 14 pages, double-sided.
7 pages.
Oh, is it 7 pages double-sided? Sorry.
14 total.
Okay. That's not so bad. So we'll require you to also read that policy and acknowledge that you've read the whole policy as well. I appreciate you all being here and taking this time. Less time than we said, eh? That's pretty good. They're all very happy. You can go out for coffee now. Great. Do you have anything else you want to add?
No, that's it for now.
Okay,
We
good.
can always do next week.
Right, so again, we'll be, Children's Ministry, Youth Ministry will be talking about some of these details as well, more details as time comes. So thanks again for your attendance. Have a good night.